Good afternoon and most welcome to H775. This is the easier lecture of the day. It's going to be a bit more conversational in a sense. I will try to cover the area a little bit from above, from the side and underneath. I'm going to pose some questions here, and I named the whole lecture, Why is Knowledge so Short-Termed? Why is it so shallow and not leading? And we take knowledge to be just information and not something guiding, a forceful power. Postmodernism is in this aspect similar in many ways to analytical philosophy, classical physics, or logocentrism, or whatever of these foundational terms you use. We disregard knowledge today. It seems to be a sheer nothing, and even the defenses I mentioned earlier, they are not the only one, but Steven Pinker and Daniel Dennett seem in itself not to be informed by knowledge. It is a little bit like hearing somebody saying we should attack windmills or some sort. They don't seem to be standing on firm grounds, and their words do not carry any weight. And what about reality? For most people, reality today seems a little boring and determined. We never go into the deep anymore, and nothing really can happen. The only thing we can do is observe. And a friend of mine said actually that he wanted to have cameras all over the world so he could observe everything at the same time. So for him it was just about enough to observe everything, to know everything. That sort of knowledge didn't take any action into the perspective. His own intention, what he wanted, what he thought, what he was, that was not really part of the point. It was just enough to observe everything, to know everything. That is in itself quite remarkable. And I'd say that's a very good indication that nothing can happen. Otherwise you wouldn't be able to look out into the world with all those cameras to get a firm picture of the world. It has to be pretty stable. And you're looking at the world doesn't for some reason affect anything. So the only option he or others have is to see it on a distance. Distance meaning to see it without attitude, intention. The thinking is not important, one's own thinking, one's interior is not interesting. And of course, creativity doesn't come into the picture. We seem to think, and I actually think we do think, that creativity is something completely different. That's something an AD, an art designer, does when he works, or a good artist of some sort. Maybe a copywriter is imaginative with words, and maybe an author can say things with words. But if you go to education these days, everything is out there somehow. The idea is creativity is not there. Everything is predetermined. Might this be the reason that we are abandoning all knowledge? Because it is already determined what it contains. It cannot be seen differently. Could it be that all our analysis all our viewing of all text and all verses and all sayings and all observations has been made and are now ready, pre-packed. They cannot be changed, they can only be seen in one way, and therefore everything is pretty much determined. And of course, this is the view of the educational system in its wholeness. It takes as an absolute hypothesis that everything that happens is all we have, and that cannot be changed. That is pretty definitely out there already. So the only role of the educational system is to deliver that, to give it, so the one who's the learner can own it in that exact manner. And I remember that myself, actually. This is a remembrance that came to me today, and I've forgotten that. But I read in school many years ago, I think it was an introduction to what is objective or what is knowledge and all that. And it said that it is objective that something is 1.5 meters. That is objective. It can be checked. But it's not objective that filet mignon is better than hot dog. And I thought to myself, this must be wrong. But I didn't have any argument at all. And in the end, after a long time, I had to accept it, even though I felt it to be completely wrong. And the weird thing is, even if the whole world would have thought that hot dogs were of lesser quality than filet mignon, it still would be subjective. It seemed to me that as long as any human beings had any finger or anything to do with anything, it became tainted, subjective. Maybe what I was forgetting at that stage was who measured the 1.5 meters. I didn't think of that. And I had to blame everybody else in this case, because no one else thought about that. Not the authors of the book and not anyone in the educational system. And I would say that is a question. That is a question that later, well, could have been at the same time, but almost as late, was asked. But you see here, it's like there are two things. One thing is subjective, the other thing is objective. These two things exist, but one is sort of better than the other one, the objective side. And why is it better? In what aspects? Yeah, well, for one reason, it seems in this view that the objective somehow is the ultimate building block of what is subjective. So the subjective is actually built of the objective. The atoms, you can explain it a different way. Maybe the view of Dennett is the most clear. He says the molecules and his nerves in his head are actually built of objective matter, and therefore the subjective is almost nothing, or is nothing. It's built of something else that is better. Objective stuff is much better than subjective stuff, and therefore he doesn't even exist. So Daniel Dennett would actually have a very good answer to this very complicated and hard question to answer that the wise man from the Ottoman Empire, the old wise Sufi master Hoxha, couldn't answer. Hoxha was a really wise man. He could answer all questions in the world. And he was sitting in the square taking his tea, and people came to him for advice and difficult questions. And he sat there for years, for decades. He became older and older. And one day a young fellow came to him, and he asked the Venerable Hodja, Honorable Hodja, has it ever happened to you that there was a question you couldn't answer? And the Hodja thought long and deep. And then he said, yes, it has happened to me once, my son. Many years ago, a friend of mine asked me what I was doing in his wife's bed in the middle of the night. That question I could not answer. I think Daniel Dennett could have answered that question. He could have said to the other noble citizens that he doesn't exist. And therefore, no punishment would occur, because as long as I gather, the wisdom in the Ottoman Empire would have been so great that would have understand that he doesn't really exist. So they should just let him go. Give him a baklava maybe, and a cup of tea, and even a hat, and cheer him hooray or something like that. Not the sinister punishment that you all think that he would have received. Does this hold true? Well, I don't think so. Not in any sensible case can we refer to ourselves as not existing. And still, for some mad reason, there are people claiming that. Daniel Dennett is not alone. Far from it. I would say, if you really ponder, that will be the majority decision among educated people these days. I do not exist. I am made from a substance that is more pertinent or more important than any subjective. This is actually what you hear from educational TV like PBS and even Swedish Utbildningskanalen. And I think it's this tendency, if it is a tendency, I don't know, but it seems that our knowledge got stuck somewhere. And in between two chairs, it feels like we had to choose one chair, and we can't use both. One is subjective, the other one is objective. But I think it could be solved by letting both chairs exist at the same time. And maybe now we can actually have the old good stuff, but we can see them in a new way. We don't necessarily have to interpret them as we always had. And be honest now, do you really think it was the intention of William Shakespeare that his work should only be interpreted one way? I have an incredibly hard time to believe that. He would not have liked it if he even knew what it was to have only one interpretation. But possibly many years of analyzing, possibly many years of destroying his work by taking it apart, and led people to believe that there's only one way to see it, maybe two ways. But both ways have to be at least explicit somehow. No, I think we can actually have a sort of merger between what Alan Bloom says and Jacques Derrida means. I think both these two gentlemen would have despised each other if they ever met each other, but I don't think they are that incompatible. I think if they would have shook hands, Derrida would have showed Alan Bloom that Shakespeare can be read in so many different ways, so every time you read it, it's fresh and new. Like actually the first read of a poem, that crisp freshness, like a spring morning when the dew just dissipated in the sunlight and everything feels so fresh, so new, and the colors are saturated and you really feel alive. Once that disappeared, we have nothing left. And I think that's the reason we abandoned the old canonical masterpieces. I think that's the reason we try to reform knowledge. We call it reform it. Take away all the old stuff and trying to make it fresh with a monasemic idea. And then it has to sound differently. We have to rename it for it to be new. It's not enough to reread it, because we, the subject, are the ones who have become stale. We have become sane. We have become stiff. It's nothing to do with Shakespeare. And if you don't believe it, I even heard works, books that been interpreted in ways one couldn't even fathom. I heard that once upon a time a modest proposal of Jonathan Swift were interpreted in such a way that the person, it was a girl in this case, thought, with all due right, that a modest proposal was meant to be taken just as he wrote it. And that was probably the first time in world history. I don't think anybody on this earth ever thought that before. But that goes to show that it is possible. Even that is possible. I don't know how she was inside to think it should be taken literal. But as you all know, Jonathan Swift in his modest proposal said that we can fix the famine in Ireland by letting the Irish people eat what?
Their children.
The children. And of course, said the teacher, this is not how it's supposed to be interpreted. And I said, it could actually. Could always happen. And sometimes, and this is the most interesting part maybe, with this collapse of the superposition, sometimes we can't even describe what is the meaning. So sometimes some words are actually vibrating between two different meanings. And even though that trademark is most obvious with people like William Blake, it's something that always exists, this trembling between two meanings, vibrating between two or three meanings, and they're all present at the same time. And they can be present just like two chairs are present. It is when we start to understand our role in the whole thing, this actually we who give one singular meaning. It's nothing to do with Shakespeare in itself or any other pieces of art, architecture, you name it, historical facts. Whatever it is, it always have a lot of different meanings. And we at Living People, the more we live, the more we are present, the more we understand that we can always change the perspective. Like good old Banting, who changed his perspective, draw something from something he saw, take it to some other area, and all of a sudden it comes to life. All of a sudden it's stronger. And all of a sudden you made a discovery. Why would science be different than literature? Prose, lyric. It never was in the past. It wasn't that like in the Renaissance. It wasn't that in the time of Shakespeare. And I would say it still is. Still vibrating between meanings. And you have to intentionally block that out. And here we see the tension of modern people. This attitude of only one meaning is a tension in the body, always, because it cannot be upheld. I would claim that's an impossibility. you need to tense yourself. You need to put yourself in an attitude. You need to sort of fossilize, being locked in some way. And only by doing that, you can no longer see the beauty in the different meanings of everything. I got this thinking the other day when I heard this terrible story about some young chaps that went to the Amazons in the 80s. The poor chaps got lost, and they also lost the sight of each other. And the terrible experience just got worse and worse. One fell into the water and he was almost drowned, and he came up 4 kilometers from the others, and he had to go through the jungle for 27 days, I think, without food. And when he was almost dead, one of his other friends actually managed to get to a missionary station and brought her help. He paid himself. A oarsman went into the jungle, almost at gunfront, forced the boat driver to go up, and he actually found him. And of course, must be the most terrible thing, one of the most terrible things you can ever experience. Think about the despair. And this fellow, his name was Jossi, an Israeli. They asked him, how are you coping now? Are you not traumatized? Well, that was an incredible experience, and it was the most painful thing I ever experienced. But another twist on the whole thing was that really changed my life. I saw new things in everything after that. And he became some sort of inventor / creator, in teaching other people now how to see things differently. Even such a door, like drowning in a horrible river. And at that time, one of the most worst thing for me that really made my nerves shiver was at that time, he could have been something like 100, 150 kilometers from any living being. That is in itself is incredible. Maybe today the Amazon has more people. At those times it didn't. That's really crazy. That's a scare in itself. Be that lonely. So you see here, on a personal level, your memories need to be polysemic as well. I suggested the idea thoughts should be polysemic and are polysemic. But think about memories. We often regard them almost in the way I described here. We often regard canonical works of great masters in only one way. But your own memory can actually, and I think they already are, trembling with different meanings. They are polysemic. And that made me thinking this chap's experience about drowning in a river and being so far from any human being and then being saved. I thought to myself, I never want to have that experience. But he thought he wouldn't like to live without it. He didn't say it was a pleasant experience, but he said he didn't want to live without it. And imagine the valiance of the other person, not giving up on his friend. He hadn't seen him in 27 days, and everyone around him, everyone, said he's lost. He's taken by the jungle. And I think that's a rather clear conclusion. You don't survive 27 days in the jungle. How would you? But he did. And that, I think, it would be for the other person also something strengthening, to stay in your belief despite all the evidence. So you see, this also takes the future into perspective. Also the future is polysemic and needs to be polysemic. And I don't think we can even do future. We talked about pronation and retrobation, doing future and doing past. those are actually movements, and movements are in themselves polysemic. They need to be strong. We cannot only have one pointing force when we move about. The strength of the chaotic system, that is our movement, can only be strong when it has different directions, different arrows going in different directions, because they strengthen the one arrow. That's chaos theory. That's what makes things strong. The other thing actually makes it much weaker. And this is what's happening since maybe the last centuries. It's a weakening. We think that by keeping only one direction we make anything stronger. By keeping only one meaning we make it more persistent. It's just the opposite. We've been weakening things for a long time now. Let me just give you an example. They discovered this quite recently. They put trees in a sort of biodome, really big. I think it was in Texas somewhere. It was incredibly big. They want to see if we could create our own world within the biodome. And they had plants, trees, small animals, germs, viruses, water, you name it, they have it all. They even had their own rain. So they managed. But for some mad reason, the trees wouldn't survive. They grew up and they fell. They grew up and they fell. And they tried this for a very, very long time, and they didn't know what it was, because the trees had everything. They had nutrition, they had sunlight, they had carbon dioxide, they had the animals to interact with them, they had the fungi, all what a tree needs. So they fought. But we also need tension. We also need adversity. It turned out what the trees were lacking was wind. They don't grow strong without wind. And since there was no wind in the biosphere, they all died. That goes to show we need those things. And by sticking to one view, which is an impossibility in itself, by tensing yourself and getting over focus, and actually that's a movement of the eyes. And I don't going to go into that now, but that's an information from this chap Blair. And he says that eyes get tension when you read a text in a monosemic way. He doesn't call it that, but that's what he means. It's a tensioning. You try to grasp the meaning. You are much too into it. You forget the surrounding thing. You forget your wind. Just like the trees. You try to isolate yourself. And you think, the only way I can understand this is tense my mind somehow. Make it like a little camera or microscope. Maybe this model is coming from science itself. Maybe, yeah. And that's a tensing. That's actually tensing of the eyes. And that tensing of the eyes, in the end, make the eyes oval. Make you nearsighted. So that's a tendency from the beginning, trying to see the text as only one. And isn't it interesting that constitute our all subjectivity? So somewhere the wish of these people to really further the text is self-defeating. Let me just take one text here, which was rather pertinent here. I'm just going to do the quote first, and then I'm going to tell you who wrote it. Persons are subjects of thought and action. They live in a world that science has so successfully managed to understand. As subjects, persons have a particular perspective on the world and the actions in it. Call it the subjective perspective. Persons are also capable of transcending this subjective perspective and of thinking about the world and the behavior in a detached manner. I mentioned this the other day. They are capable of viewing the world not not just from here and from the point of view of humanity, but also of viewing it from nowhere in particular. That is from the book The View from Nowhere on Thomas Nagel. He identified that there are actually two things a human being can do. It's possibly much more, but I called it the other day mirroring. And is that you see yourself in the mirror and you start thinking yourself as an object in the world. Because you need to have some sort of mirroring in the start to do that. And this actually happened somewhere in history. We began to mirror ourselves. Animals can't do that. Actually, they can't do anything like it. But we can do that. And that is a fantastic tool. But the problem starts to occur when we think that is the only view. That's the only monocenic view on ourselves. And I'd say, I'm not exaggerating now, I share this view with Thomas Nagel. That's the predominant view today in the Western society. That is the truer view. And it doesn't need to be complemented by any other view. And actually, any such involvement that takes myself into the picture is going to debase whatever is out there, is going to make it sordid even, not as clear, affected by subjectivity. And this goes to show it's a very clear and concise book, not too big, but it's something to keep under your bed or under your cushion, something like that, because it's a great read. It wakes you up to your own tendency to think that something is more valuable than the other. And you can see that these different things are not so unrelated as we usually think. There's actually a very clear relationship. And I tried to show this the other day. I don't think it was 100% clear, but we always measure things. And there is always a person that measures things. Even 1.5 meters. It doesn't disappear. That doesn't mean we can't use the 1.5 meters as an objective fact. Yes, you can do that. But never ever forget how it started. Because once you do that, that's when you start to push down the subjective side. And in the end, you will end up like Daniel Dennett or worse on the mental hospital. That's actually the view of Ian McGilchrist. It's even clearer expounded in his book, The Matter with Things, where he shows that the majority of people sitting in mental hospitals today are actually so affected by this view, they go insane. Because you lose both the objective and the subjective in the end. If you ever spoken to a schizophrenic person, it's not like he knows the objective side either. No, not at all. He's lost them both. He's stuck in a mode, and his eyes actually look like microscopes, literally. It's the weirdest eyes you ever can see. And to be on the other side of that eyes, I always thought that must be horrible. Because they are seeing, but at the same time, they are not seeing anything at all. They are blind, completely blind to reality. Blinded eyes. And this is a new phenomenon, and it's supported by this tendency. Of course, this is the most extreme case, but it could also be good to ponder about a little bit about this. When we get into that mood too much, we lose it somewhere on the strand. Objective mode is a real mood, it's a working mood, but it should always be accompanied by something practical, where you are situated in reality. Think about the first person who invented the meter, if that helps. I don't remember his name, I can find it out, but it was one person. And the meter is constructed by, we divided the circumference of the Earth by 10,000, I think it was. And then we got the meter. And once we have the meter, we can construct the cubic meter, which gave us 1,000 liters, because we thought it was too big of a measure to have 1,000 liters. To go into the shop and order 1,000th of a cubic meter would have been a bit complicated. So they changed that to 1 liter. But you can see it's derivative. It starts with a meter. Everything in our measuring system starts with a meter. So it has a start, but at that very start was a human being. It was never made without a human being. So in a way, the school book was completely wrong. How can it be objected in the eyes of the one who wrote it in the school book, and why did he write it? Could anybody write such a stupid thing? And sending poor school children into the wrong direction, I think that's almost an act of meanness, because it sure did send me into the wrong direction, probably loads of my school friends. But it's absolutely wrong. That doesn't mean that the objective doesn't have a role to play. It has, together with practicality. Never forget how it started. That's the role of history. And by using history, we can once more ground ourselves and understand that both the objective and the subjective gets better if I'm here and now, taking in the environment and not over-focus when I read something, trying to get only one meaning into one thing, which is in itself a dead end, I'd say. It only gets worse and worse. So my recommendation is, please, a very readable book. Try and read it sometime at least. It's nothing special when it comes to complicated words, nothing like that. It's a good scribe thing, and he has 2 or 3 other small books that can be recommended as well, but this is the most recommendable of his literature. A Point from Nowhere, an insight into modern thinking and how we can cure it. I say thank you very much, and I wish you all a very pleasant afternoon. Bye.
Thank you.